Welcome to this Exam Insights session exploring how students performed in the Summer 2024 iPrimary Global Citizenship exam set by Pearson Edexcel. This session is for teachers of the specification and it's in two parts. Firstly, we will briefly review the topics and exam structure, the question types, command terms, mark scheme requirements and assessment objectives that are used to create the test for your students. It's a relatively new exam. Summer 2024 was the first time students sat this examination. So it's worth taking a look at what some of the unique features of the exam are and to think about how we might be able to help students do even better in the future. The second part, which is longer, looks at actual examples of marked scripts from the Summer 2024 exam. We'll see some high-scoring examples where students did very well. We'll also look at examples where there was room for improvement and think about the kind of steps students might have taken to do better and advice that teachers can give to future students who will be taking this exam. So part one, as I've said, is a brief review of the topics, the exam structure, a familiarisation with what the students will be expected to do and why. This is the assessment model that's used. There are 60 marks altogether. The first section, the wider community and myself, is mostly multiple choice questions. Every effort has been made to reduce the reading burden to keep them as short as possible, and there are no hidden hurdles. These are questions that allow students to tell us what they know and to begin to apply their knowledge. We then have three sections with 45 marks overall, using the headings myself and my community, myself as a citizen, and myself as a global citizen. Here there are 1 mark and also more stretching 2-mark questions for the candidates to answer. And every section ends with a 3-mark question based on a short source or stimulus. The assessment objectives for the test are as follows. A01, Assessment Objective 1, is a demonstration of knowledge and understanding. 50%, half the marks of the exam, are reserved for this. This is where students can tell us what they've learned during the course. Questions will be straightforward. What does such and such a term mean? What does this mean? Then we move to assessment objectives 2 and 3, where the candidates have to go a step further. Students need to take the knowledge and understanding they've gained from the course and apply it to particular propositions, questions, contexts. We'll see some examples of questions like this later on. There are also some marks, 15%, for them to interpret and evaluate information. This might require them to look at a resource and tell us something about it. The exam draws on the Global Citizenship specification by choosing 4 linked themes that move across the entire course. We're going to be looking at social justice, identity and diversity, globalization, interdependence, peace and conflict, human rights, power and governance, and finally, sustainable development, the big issues facing the planet and our climate. All of these may feature at various points during the exam that your students will be taking. One unique feature of this course and the accompanying exam is an emphasis on my country, the place where the students live. The students are global citizens, but they are national citizens too, and part of the learning focuses on where they live, its environment, its society, its culture, and its economy. Each year, the exam will give students space to tell us about the country and its issues, what they love about it. They will name their country at the top of the page and answer a series of questions which are informed by their knowledge and understanding of their own country. This year, in the Summer 2024 exam, there were opportunities for students to tell us about the culture and nature of different countries. The questions are straightforward, providing they're always read carefully. Another important feature of the test is the way that each of sections B, C and D finishes with a 3-mark question linked to a source and a text box. Students are shown a thought-provoking picture image and asked to consider how they might address certain problems or issues associated with that context. So this is a very good example, an illustration of how students are applying what they've learnt in the course and making it useful. Here we can see there was a focus on civil demonstrations, people protesting about a particular issue. Perhaps it was climate change. People are allowed to hold different views. And this question said, how might you deal with certain problems that arise when people are expressing their own views and saying how they feel about things, whether that is your own friends or perhaps protesters in a more public example of people expressing their views. In every case, students will always be encouraged to read very carefully these questions before they start to answer them, and to note any restrictions. In particular, you'll note that in this question, they were asked how should these problems be dealt with in a positive way, and that was very important when it came to answering the question. We now move on to part 2 of the presentation, reviewing marked scripts from the recent Summer 2024 exam, actual examples of how students tried to tackle these questions. Firstly, let's take a look at some of the multiple choice questions that appeared in section A. Around 1/4 of students couldn't answer this question, for example. It asked them what a stereotype is. Now, this is a key idea that appears in the specification in the section dealing with injustices. What's important to realise here is it is a straightforward assessment objective 1 question. The students are being directly tested about what that term means. So, what is the correct answer? Stereotypes are based on generalisations. But there are other types of question that feature in section A as well. These are looking at a different assessment objective where students are having to either analyse and interpret a statement or apply their own knowledge to it. If we look at this example, question 13, around 1/3 of students couldn't answer this correctly. Now, it relates to people's identity and the idea that some people, by nature, are perhaps shy. But rather than asking the students what the word shy means, they have been asked to apply their understanding of what shyness means to a context. Which of the following would you advise a shy person to do? Now, this is an assessment objective 2 question. It requires students to remember what shy means and then to think carefully about what the best answer here is. They're applying knowledge to a context. And the key here, of course, is that shy people should be advised to tell their friends their ideas, to not be afraid to put their own ideas forward. Leading a school assembly would be a step too far. And shy people wouldn't necessarily be advised to do what other people say or to always listen to other people. The logical answer to find your way towards is statement D. Tell your friends your ideas. And around 2/3 of students identified this as the correct answer. Here's another example of an assessment objective 2 question. The question is focusing on rules, an important concept from the course. But the question doesn't say what is a rule, what does the word rule mean. It asks students to take their understanding of the word rule and apply it to a context. It's an assessment objective 2 question. Think carefully about the context and what the correct answer might be. Apply your knowledge to this. Here, the context is a group of friends. Rules agreed by friends and not by an outsider are more likely to be what? And the answer is that they're more likely to be accepted because they are created by consent by a group of friends. Alongside the tick box multiple choice items that appear in section A, you can sometimes expect to see questions that use this format, where students are instead invited to circle the correct answer. This is another example of an assessment objective 1 question. It's a simple test of whether students have remembered the meaning of an important term or word. Which one of these words describes a one-sided media report? And the answer, of course, was biased. Brilliantly, around 3/4 of students were able to answer this correctly and knew this important word. Bias is an important idea that appears repeatedly in the course. Around 1/4 of students were unable to remember what it meant, however. In closing, a few summary statements about multiple choice questions. Important ideas to really reinforce when you're talking to your students ahead of the exam. They've got to make sure they have not got any knowledge gaps. As we've seen, if you can't remember what the word bias means, it could cost you a mark. So students are advised to keep a glossary of important words that they need to remember. They should also think carefully when they're asked to apply their knowledge and understanding to a novel context. Don't rush these questions. Read the 4 responses carefully and think about what the best answer is. And a good piece of overarching advice is to always make sure all the boxes are ticked. Some students this year didn't tick boxes on students where they were unsure what the answer was. Now, it is always worth ticking a box even if you don't know what the answer is, because there is a 1 in 4 chance that you will get the mark. We're moving now to the part of the presentation that explores how students answered 1-mark questions in last summer's exam. Here is the first one we'll look at, question 16. Give 1 reason why it's important for children to play together. This question was answered correctly by around 2/3 of the candidates. They needed to make a link between playing and working together and the broader citizenship idea of being part of a community and of building relationships, key ideas that they should have studied as part of the course. The question is quite clear. It asks about the importance of children playing together, not just why they play together, but why it is important, which was a big clue that the answer should hopefully tell us something that is important from a citizenship perspective. Here are the kinds of answers that we were looking for. And you'll notice there's a strong emphasis here on building relationships, developing friendships, getting to know others, moving from being an individual to being part of a community. And some answers were disallowed, particularly those that simply said, well, it's fun, it's better than being on your own. The better answers, and we have to draw a line somewhere, were those that explained a little bit about the importance of friendships and relationships. I'll show you a couple of answers. What we'll do as we go through these is you can pause the film, look at the mark scheme, decide what marks you would give, and then press play, and I can reveal what marks the items were given in the summer exam. So pause now and press play when you've made a decision. So this answer got 1 mark, the idea of building friendships, which is enough to begin to convey the idea of becoming part of a group, becoming part of a collective, part of a community. In contrast, this answer didn't get the mark, so they can be happy. That doesn't really tell us the importance of playing together. Children can be happy on their own, they can be happy doing many things. And the phrase get a positive power, very difficult to know what this student meant with that. So that is a good first example of the type of differentiation going on within this test. A second example here. Question 20A. Give 1 reason why it's wrong to judge people based only on their appearance. This is drawing on the part of the specification J44. And thematically it's linking with the idea of injustice and unfairness, and the idea that to just judge people on their appearances is really not a fair way to treat anybody. Give them a chance. That was the spirit behind this question, and here are some of the ideas the mark scheme wanted to credit. The idea that appearance is purely superficial, that it can lead to a misjudgment, it doesn't tell us about other important things that we don't know yet. As previously, I'll now show you 2 answers. You pause, have a think about what marks you'd give them, and then press play, and I'll reveal what the answers are. This was awarded 0 marks. The answer, the way they look like. There wasn't enough here to be able to award a mark. Whereas this item, because they could feel sad, and they must have a nice heart inside them. Essentially, we've got 2 reasons here. It's wrong to judge people on their appearance because it could make them feel sad, and they may have a nice heart inside them. There are two things here. We wouldn't negatively mark, so whichever is the best reason gets the mark. And the idea that they could have a nice heart inside conveys sufficiently the idea that judging by appearances is wrong, and it doesn't tell us all there is to know about someone. A third example of a 1 mark written answer is this, 26A. Give one example of a recent dispute in your country. This is in the section where students are invited to tell us about their own country, or they will be answering questions that are informed by their understanding of their own country. The key thing here is the word dispute, the idea of a dispute, a disagreement, something being contested within your country, and hoping to hear something specific as an example. The mark scheme had a number of possible ways of answering this question, the idea that there might be a political or an industrial dispute, there could even be a conflict or civil war in some contexts, that there might be problems surrounding an election or a dispute around the environment. Many possible ways of answering this. Let's have a look at a couple of student responses. Read these, look at the mark scheme, and then pause. Press play when you're ready and I'll reveal the marks. This was awarded 1 mark. It was deemed specific enough. In my country, a recent dispute was about the need to be the president. So there's clearly an idea here that there was a dispute linked with political elections or who was the president. In contrast, this second example here was thought to be too unclear. It's not really an example, it's a general idea that there will be disputes if people fight each other. In many ways, it's a restating of the question using a synonym. Give one example of a recent fight in your country. People fight. It just wasn't enough provided here for a mark to be awarded, sadly. Another example of a 1 mark question. State one way a country can benefit from giving refugees a home. Now this was the hardest question on the examination for students in summer 24. Only around a quarter of students answered this correctly. The reason being that the majority misread the question. It's always a problem in exams under high stakes with the clock ticking that a certain percentage of students will rush and not read a question properly. Good advice to give to students, no matter how young they are, is to underline key words. Here, the key phrase was, country can benefit. The idea that the benefit is for the country, not for the refugees. Here are some of the possible answers here. Notice the way the mark scheme has bolded that it must be benefits to the country and that we couldn't credit benefits to the refugee. The answers, quite simply, might be that there's more people to work, people with new culture that might add to diversity, people who could pay taxes. So any broad understanding about how additional people could help enhance the economy or culture of a society would lead to the award of the mark. Here are 2 responses from actual exam papers this summer. Have a look at these, read the mark scheme, decide which marks you would award. Pause the screen now while you decide and press play when you're ready. No marks were awarded to this second item. The country can help them. That is misidentifying what the question's asking, talking about how the country can help the refugees, not how the country benefits when it decides to give refugees a home. It's also extremely vague. What is the help that's being offered, we might ask. The other example is more specific. This is from the minority of students who answered correctly. More productivity, because more people. So this is the idea that perhaps the country's economy gets a boost when there are more people living there. So this was awarded the mark. Before we move on to 2 mark questions, here's a brief written summary of what we have discovered about the 1 mark written answers. Top of the list is wondering if students are paying enough attention to the specific question we've asked them. Have they underlined? Have they understood? Have they paid attention to all the details of the question? and the example of how a country can benefit from migration and refugees is a very good example of where this wasn't done this year. Secondly, have they paused to think about why the question is worded quite the way it is? Why have we focused in on the importance of playing together, for example? Does this give a clue about the kind of answer we want? What might make playing together an important action for individuals and societies? And thirdly, in general, students should be asking if they've provided a sufficiently detailed answer or are just providing a very general idea that might not get the mark, sometimes really just repeating the question in a different way, using a synonym like fight instead of dispute. As a rule, the more specific the answer they give, the greater the chance it is of getting the mark. In this part of the presentation, we move on to looking at 2-mark written answers, where the tariff is increased from 1 to 2 marks. Sometimes this takes the form of 2 separate responses. It's a doubling up, if you like. Identify 2 other personal qualities a human rights defender might need. The students here are still being tested on AO1 recall, but they're being asked to retrieve 2 pieces of information rather than 1. But there's another type of question where there are 2 marks for development of a single idea. As with this question, explain what's meant by the term equal opportunities. There are now 2 marks available and 4 lines. This sends a signal that the person marking it is hoping to see some development, not just a simple 1-sentence, 1-line answer, but a little bit more about this key citizenship concept. The second mark, therefore, is going to be reserved for greater depth of explanation, showing some real understanding of what this means. Let's look at this first example then, the one where there are 2 marks available, 2 knowledge retrieval marks. A human rights defender should show leadership, identify 2 other personal qualities that human rights defender might need. Now, just over half of all students scored 2 marks on this question, which was great to see, but the remainder scored 1 or 0. A significant number of students didn't engage with this very well at all. Sometimes it was because they wrote the same quality twice using slightly different words. It needs to be 2 different qualities. Good advice to students is to try and make the 2 ideas as different as possible while remaining relevant. Here are some of the answers that featured in the mark scheme. The idea that human rights defender might need to be honest, a hard worker, to have a strong belief, a good communicator. There are many different things that might serve here to gain a mark. So have a read of these 2 examples of student work. In both cases, you've got 2 decisions to make now. There's the mark scheme for reference. Have a read. Decide what marks you give them, and then I'll tell you what the answers are. So pause now and press play when you're ready. This answer, I imagine you've spotted, didn't gain any credit. It's not well done at all. The idea that personal qualities would be food to eat and clothes to wear. Sadly, this student really hasn't got what this question is asking them about. In contrast, this answer scored 2 marks. Both the idea of being courageous and being determined, these are ideas in the mark scheme. They're also ideas that I think we'd all identify a human rights defender would need. You might need to be courageous sometimes, standing up for people in difficult situations, and you might have to be very determined to see the work through. Note that a single word answer is absolutely sufficient here. The command word identify or give allows for the mark to be awarded for a single statement if it clearly conveys what we're looking for. Otherwise, a different command word or phrase, such as explain, would be used, which sends an indication that you're going to have to keep writing a bit more. So for students who struggle to write a lot, this is an important message for them, that it is okay just to write very short, focused answers. Indeed, spending more time reading the question and less time writing might be a good technique for some students to use. Here's another example of an AO1 knowledge retrieval, knowledge-based question. This format features two definitions that need to be completed. State what is meant by economic migrant and asylum seeker. 2 lines are provided for each. Interestingly, less than half of all students scored 2 marks here. A mark of 1 was more typical. Quite a few students struggled with trying to remember what an asylum seeker is, or their definition of economic migrant didn't add enough detail for the mark to be awarded. These are important terms within the specification, and it's a reminder that students who want to do well in this exam might want to think about putting together a glossary of some of the key terms and ideas that they can have a read through the day before the exam. Here is the mark scheme. It shows that for economic migrant, we just wanted the idea that it's people moving for work, moving for money, and that the asylum seeker is someone who's been forced away by danger or is being persecuted and looking for help elsewhere. We've got 2 examples here. Have a read, decide whether you would award the marks or not. Press pause now and press play when you're ready to hear what the actual marks were. This answer was only awarded 1 mark. The idea that the economic migrant is someone who travels because of opportunities in different countries, well, that's sufficient. It doesn't say economic opportunity, but this is an example where, with either a mark of 1 or 0 to award, we would give the benefit of the doubt that there is a sense here that there's an opportunity, that this is optional, that there's a pull, presumably of better work going on. The second definition, though, is a problem. Some seeking international information. There's nothing there to convince us that the student really knows what an asylum seeker is, so unfortunately, no mark could be awarded there. The other response was awarded 2 marks. The first point is fine. It's someone who travels to another country to improve their standard of life. That conveys a sense that this is a voluntary movement in search of better living standards linked with the economy. That was fine. The second answer is also fine. At first look, it might appear that there isn't a mark there, but what they've said is that it's someone who flees, not spelt correctly, their home country. There you've clearly got an understanding that the asylum seeker is someone who's been pushed out and has had to go for help. Flee is not spelt right, but this isn't a spelling test. And this is a good example for you when you're grading your own students' work, that we're not going to be harsh where students of this age have not expressed themselves all that well, where their spelling, punctuation, grammar are not perfect. If the meaning and the understanding of citizenship is there, we will award the marks when we can. So this item was awarded 2 marks. Now let's take a look at the other type of 2-mark question, where there is a development mark available. It's focusing on a key concept or idea. The command is explain, suggesting we'd like a little bit of depth. The clues for the students are there are 4 lines and 2 marks available, so they need to keep going. They need to imagine their teacher marking this and finding 2 places where they're going to put ticks. In fact, just over half of all students managed to do this, scoring just 1 mark. A quarter of candidates scored 2 marks. This shows we've got a bit of work to do, helping students to understand where there are questions that they need to keep going a little bit longer or write a little bit more deeply about. 2 marks are available. The mark scheme here shows what the examiner was looking for. 1 mark for a simple answer with a 2nd mark for some development or explanation or example. The 3rd paragraph gives an example that the idea of everyone having the same chance in life would get 1 mark. And a development such as so you wouldn't be discriminated against because you're a girl or because of your gender, that would get the development mark. Let's have a look at a couple of answers here. As before, read the mark scheme, read the answers and decide on your mark. Having pressed pause, press play when you're ready to hear me tell you the marks. This gained a mark, just. There was enough there, although the word opportunity is repeated, the idea of every opportunity being given, which is implied to people, is enough to make us feel that this student is telling us it's when everybody is being given everything the same. So this just gained 1 mark in the spirit of positive marking. The second response, that's worth 2 marks. The idea is that everyone has the same rights to be equal. For example, to have a job. That's all the student needed to do, is to exemplify, to give us a little bit more detail on exactly what they mean. So it's a great strategy for your students to use in the future where there's 2 marks available. Tell them to always try and give an example or a possible detail, and they might pick up that 2nd mark. So here's a summary of the key messages for the 2-mark answers for students. There are 2 types of 2-mark question. Some will ask for, say, 2 features or 2 characteristics and will clearly tell them that the mark tariff here is 1 + 1 because there'll be 2 numbers, 1 and 2, written on the answer space where they can write 2 things. But other questions will ask for 1 thing to be explained in some depth. The approach here to answering these questions is therefore varying according to whether breadth or depth is being required. And it's probably a very good idea for students to familiarise themselves with these 2 different types of question before they take the test. As with the 1 markers, they've got to watch out for knowledge gaps. Now that there are 2 marks available, not knowing what the concept or idea is could be quite damaging to the overall score. That said, a 2-mark question is not going to be asked about a very minor idea or issue. It's far more likely to be tied to one of the big ideas, which is much fairer to students. That said, students are still strongly advised to reread the glossary of key terms ahead of their exam. Finally, we're turning our attention to the 3-mark questions. Every year, sections B, C and D will always finish in the same way, with a 3-mark question that hinges around the candidates analysing and interpreting. Finally, we're turning our attention to the 3-mark questions. Each year, sections B, C and D will all finish with one of these items. They're testing the students' analytic and interpretive skills. We present them with a photograph and a text box. We establish a context for them to think about, and then set them about solving problems, working out what might be a possible action or solution to deal with 3 issues that have arisen in this context. In last summer's 2024 examination, the first question focused on a children's playground, the idea that a new playground was being established, but that there were some potential problems that needed to be overcome, and how would we deal with those? Section C, question 29, had a question that focused on kindness and fairness by focusing in on the idea of helping the lonely, the homeless, the hungry people. Contexts were suggested and actions were sought. How would the students potentially act to help in these situations? And finally, section D ended with a focus on disagreement and the rights that people have sometimes to stand up and say they don't agree with something that's happening. The idea of peaceful protest, or of, at a smaller scale, just disagreeing with a friend. So these questions focused on the students being able to suggest positive actions in response to possible problems. Let's look in some detail now at the first question, providing and maintaining the children's playground. The 3 problems that were posed were, first of all, how do we know what to give to people? Secondly, how do we make it safe? And thirdly, are there any rules that we might need to introduce? Around half of all students scored 2 marks, which was great to see, and a quarter scored 3 marks. So there was evidence of students engaging strongly with this type of item, which invites them in with a colourful photograph to get thinking about problem solving. Here's the mark scheme that was used and some of the suggestions for possible actions. It's not an absolute list though. You'll notice that in each box the command to the markers to accept any other appropriate suggestion is there. Anything sensible, markers use their judgment. They're all teachers like you, and they use their judgment to decide whether or not they should give the mark, even if it's not something that was in the mark scheme. The main thing is that there's an answer there in the spirit of the question that logically links with what has been asked. How would you find out what equipment people wanted? Well, you could ask them questions. You could have a meeting. You could even have a social media survey. How would you make it safe for equipment? What equipment can be dangerous? Well, you might have a soft surface, put a fence around it, make sure there's regular checks and maintenance. Any of those would do. And what rules might you need? Well, any equipment for children, a very likely rule is to have adult supervision, but there are other possibilities, many of which students will be familiar with in their everyday life. Age limits to behaviour, number of turns, number of children who are allowed on at any one time. Any of these would have been acceptable. So here are two contrasting answers from the summer exam. In a moment, I'll ask you to pause, read through these and decide what mark out of 3 you would give in each case. So pause now and press play when you're ready to hear what marks were actually awarded. This item received full marks. The student did well. How would you find out about the equipment? You'd ask people. Find the most popular one. How would you make the equipment safe? You might put cushions around so that if people fell off they'd land on a cushion. Again, there's no hurdle here for spelling. It's clear what is meant. What rule could be made for the equipment? Well, not to do dangerous stunts, behave sensibly. These are super answers. The other answer also did quite well. Not as strongly as the first one, but 2 out of 3 marks were awarded here. Ask what type of equipment people would like. Find the most that was voted for. That's a nice specific answer. But when we looked at the answers to parts B and C, they're the same answer. Have an adult with the child. Have adult supervision. That works for part C, where we said, is there a rule we could use? And the rule might be, you must always have an adult with you. But it doesn't work so well for B, which says, how do you make equipment safe? The focus here should be on something you do to the equipment, such as adding cushions or soft materials. And the student here has written, keep an adult with them. So that couldn't get the mark because it didn't really answer what we'd asked them, and it also repeated the third one as well. A good piece of advice to students is to make sure that all their answers are different and that they're not repeating themselves, as well as usual, reading the question carefully. How can the equipment be made safe? The final question we'll look at today is the final question on last summer's exam. Question 36. It's focused on the right for people to disagree about important issues. We have a provocative photograph here of a group of people who clearly feel strongly about something, trying to make their opinions known using a loud hailer. And we have a text box which states that people do have the right to hold different views and usually to protest against things they think are wrong or unfair. We may not agree, but perhaps we should respect and listen to them. Now, problems arise when this is happening, and how can they be dealt with in a positive way? And that statement, positive way, is quite important for how this question is answered. Give a possible action in response to each problem. One of your friends says something you strongly disagree with. How might you respond to that in a positive way? Protesters feel threatened by people who disagree with them. Perhaps the people in the photograph. How could they respond in a positive way to a crowd that come up to them and say, why are you doing this? Demonstrators interrupt a major sporting event. How might the people at the sporting event respond to this in a positive way, to this disruption? Note that because of the emphasis on a positive way, some students perhaps found this quite hard to answer. And the mark scheme here gives some idea of the kinds of answers that were accepted. Although with many students taking the exam, there were far more suggestions than are shown here that received credit. If we look at part A, it says one of your friends says something you disagree with. Any of those would have been worth a mark. The idea that you could just politely ignore, you could discuss or criticise their views, but in a constructive way. You could listen to them, you could argue with them. Any of those would be fine. Protesters feel threatened by people who disagree with them. Ideally, we're looking for a positive response about respecting the other people's views nonetheless, avoiding provocative actions. They could also say as an answer that the police might be invited to intervene to make sure things don't get out of hand. And finally, demonstrators interrupt a major sporting event, a whole range of possible suggestions then. And you can see some of the answers that were credited there. Let's now look at a couple of student answers to this question. Just read these at face value and see whether you think these are worth the mark or not. As I've said previously, the mark scheme is only a rough guide. At the end of the day, there are many ways for students to approach these questions, and it was up to you as a teacher to decide whether you feel that they've said enough here. So, pause the film now and press play when you're ready for me to tell you what the final marks were. Well, this item was awarded 3 out of 3 because the 3 statements clearly related to what we'd asked them. They're not very sophisticated or detailed, but they do enough, particularly at this age, to gain the credit. One of your friends says something you disagree with. How do you respond? Well, you can say, I don't agree. That's fine. It's a logical response to what we've asked them. There's understanding of the question posed. Secondly, protesters feel threatened by people who disagree with them. Let's stay silent and listen to them. That's a great answer. It implies instead of shouting and getting angry, we'll stay silent for a while and we'll listen to what they've got to say. The final idea was also credited. The simple statement, stop the demonstration. It's a very simple idea, but it does work. It's logically connected to the idea, well, demonstrators are interrupting an event. It could get out of hand. What do? We stop the demonstration. So for this age group, that is seen as a reasonable response to that question, particularly when you consider this is a high-stakes, timed exam. In contrast, the other answer I've shown you gains 1 out of 3 overall. The first part, one of your friends says something that you agree with, is the best answer. Come to a negotiation. That does gain credit. The other 2 answers don't quite get there. Protesters feel threatened, so they say it's peaceful. There's a logical disconnect here, perhaps. Why would saying it's peaceful deal with the threat? The threat is still there. And the demonstrators interrupt the sporting event, give them time. This again is unclear. Who is the them? Who's the noun? And we're not sure who's being given time. Is it the demonstrators? Perhaps it is, but it just wasn't quite clear enough. So overall, this gained 1 out of 3 marks. Here's a summary of important messages for teachers and students about the 3-mark questions. Firstly, as we've seen, the answers need only be short, but the meaning needs to be clear, and there needs to be a logical connect with the proposition that is being made. The answer really should match the question, and they don't always, is one of the findings from this summer's exam. It's sometimes quite unclear who the object and the subject of the sentence are as well. And if you are teaching your own students to have a go at this as a past paper, that's some advice that might be given to them, is make sure that when they're talking about them and they in these kind of answers, that it's clear whether they're talking to the people who are the protesters or the people who are in the sporting event. It wasn't always clear in the answers who the students were talking about. They need to note if there's any answer restrictions. The best teaching advice of that from this year's summer is the restriction that you needed to deal with the demonstrations or the disagreements in a positive way. That needs to be adhered to. And students need to watch out, particularly when they're under pressure, for writing the same answer twice. It is hard to justify giving students the highest marks when two of their answers are extremely similar. To conclude, here are the key messages for teachers and students based on this review of student performance in the Summer 2024 Global Citizenship iPrimary exam. The first message is read the questions carefully, note the key focus words. Students are encouraged to underline or highlight the most important words throughout their paper. Secondly, they need to begin at this age to develop an understanding that the number of marks and the number of lines is an important guide as to how much should be written. 2-mark questions with 4 lines require a greater amount of content than a 1-mark question with 2 lines. It is important, though, that students don't overwrite and write far too long answers where there's only 1 mark available, or they may run out of time on the test as a whole. They will need to be very careful with some of the 2-mark questions. There's 1 mark for a single accurate statement. The second is for further development or explanation to show their understanding. And hopefully you'll be going away from this presentation with a good understanding of exactly what that means when it comes to students doing their work. Students are advised to never leave a multiple choice question unanswered. If they don't know the correct answer, it's worth having a guess and putting a tick on the item. It might help raise their mark, and there's no penalty for getting it wrong. They need to be familiar with the command words used in the questions: give, identify, and explain. Those are the most important signal to them about what's expected and how much depth they should go into. And finally, with the 3-mark questions, they need to read these extra carefully and follow the instructions as closely as they can. Whatever they write down needs to logically relate to the problem or the situation that's been put to them, and they need to be careful when they use words like they, that it's clear who they're talking about. Pay attention to who the noun in their sentence or statement is. And that concludes our walkthrough of the iPrimary 2024 exam. I hope you found this useful. Thank you for listening, and I hope that there's a lot of information in here that you can usefully take back to use with next year's students.